He raised his glass of bourbon and smiled at her like she was a joke he'd been saving all night. "Beg me," Lucian Varelli said, loud enough for every man in that room to hear. "Beg me to keep you, or walk out that door." 50 people went silent. 50 powerful men waited. Elena Marlowe Varelli set her champagne glass down without a sound. "I'll need a few minutes," she said. She walked upstairs. She did not cry. She did not shake. She packed 2 suitcases, retrieved an envelope she had kept hidden for 4 years, walked back downstairs, placed the divorce papers on the dining table, and walked out into a Chicago night so cold it cut straight through to the bone. She never looked back. If someone humiliated you in front of everyone you knew, would you have the strength to do what she did? Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like Elena's live. Stories about women who were underestimated, written off, pushed to the edge, and what they chose to do next. Give this video a thumbs up if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the night that changed everything. The party was Lucian's idea, as most things in that house were. He'd called it a winter gathering, which was what men like Lucian Varelli called things when they didn't want to admit they were showing off. 43 guests, by Elena's count. Politicians, contractors, a federal judge whose name appeared in newspapers at least twice a year, 2 aldermen who'd stopped pretending to be honest sometime around 2019, and a collection of businessmen whose businesses Elena had never been allowed to ask about directly. She had learned not to ask directly about a great many things. The mansion on the North Shore sat back from the lake behind iron gates and old oak trees, and on a night like this, January, bitter, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache, it blazed with light and warmth, and the particular energy of powerful men who believed the world outside their windows existed primarily to confirm their importance. Elena had organized this party. She'd chosen the caterers, approved the floral arrangements, confirmed the bar setup with the events manager, and greeted every guest at the door with the precise warmth her husband expected. She wore a dress he had selected. She'd had her hair done at the salon he preferred. She smiled when he smiled, moved toward whoever he gestured her toward, and laughed at the right moments with the right softness. She had become very, very good at this. What she had not become was happy. 9 years has a way of clarifying things, if you let it. And Elena Marlowe, she still thought of herself by her original name in the private architecture of her mind, had spent 9 years clarifying exactly who Lucian Varelli was, what he required of the people around him, and what that requirement had cost her. The evenings started the way these evenings always started. Lucian was charming, expansive, magnetic. He had a gift for making rooms feel like they'd been waiting for him to arrive, and he worked the party like a man who genuinely loved the sound of his own laughter bouncing off high ceilings. Elena circulated. She refreshed drinks. She facilitated introductions. She was, in the language of her husband's world, an excellent hostess. By 9 o'clock, the bourbon had started doing what bourbon does. She noticed the shift the way you notice a change in weather. Not the rain itself, but the particular quality of the air before it comes. Lucian's voice got slightly louder. His gestures got slightly larger. He began pulling men closer, hand on the arm, conspiratorial leans, the kind of physical confidence that said, "I own this room and everyone in it." Elena was standing near the window talking to Margaret Delaney, the wife of one of Lucian's contractors, when she heard her own name from across the room. "My wife." Not Elena. Not a full sentence. Just my wife, the way you'd say my car or my watch. She turned to find Lucian with one arm around the shoulders of a man she recognized as Alderman Briggs, both of them looking at her with the particular expression of men who'd already decided what the punchline was. "Come here," Lucian called. She crossed the room. She kept her face pleasant. "You know what I was just telling Dennis?" Lucian said to her. "I was telling him how much Elena loves this house." "I do," she said. "She loves it so much," Lucian said, turning back to Briggs, "that I'm not sure she's aware there's a world outside it." Briggs laughed. Elena smiled. Inside her chest, something that had been tightening for years drew one increment tighter. "That's not quite accurate," she said, very quietly. Lucian looked at her. Just a glance, a fraction of a second, a calibration. "Of course not," he said smoothly, moving on. "Elena keeps me humble." The evening continued. She noticed Lucian watching her twice more after that. Quick assessments, there and gone before anyone else would catch them. She had learned to notice these things. He was in a particular mood tonight, and she couldn't quite locate its shape. There was something underneath the performance, something that had been there all week, actually. A tightness around his jaw when he thought no one was looking. A phone call taken behind a closed door on Tuesday that had lasted 40 minutes. Lucian didn't take 40-minute phone calls behind closed doors unless something had unsettled him. She didn't let herself think too hard about that. She had learned not to reach for things before she was ready for what she might find. By 10:30, the room had loosened into the comfortable chaos of a successful party in its final hours. Jackets were off. Someone had started telling a story about a fishing trip in loud, theatrical installments. The bar had transitioned from cocktails to whiskey and wine. Children who had been brought to the early portion of the evening had been taken home by drivers, and the room had become exclusively the territory of adults who had nowhere to be and no reason to leave. Elena was in the kitchen coordinating with the catering staff when she heard the room go quiet. Not entirely quiet, but the particular quality of sound changed. The volume dropped, the texture shifted, in a way that made her hand stop moving mid-sentence. She excused herself. She walked back through the kitchen door. Lucian was standing in the center of the main room. He had a glass of bourbon in his right hand and the entire party's attention in a way that was different from his earlier showmanship. This wasn't performance. This was something else. Elena read it in 3 seconds and felt the back of her neck go cold. "Elena," he said. "Good. Come here." She walked toward him slowly. The room watched. "I was just telling these gentlemen," Lucian said, "that Elena and I have reached a crossroads." She stopped 6 feet away. "Lucian, 9 years," he said, cutting her off pleasantly, turning slightly to address the room. 9 years, and I think we've both arrived at a point of—" He paused, savoring it. "Evaluation." The room was very still. Margaret Delaney, near the fireplace, had stopped breathing visibly. "I'm not going to do this here," Elena said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that after. "You're not going to do what?" Lucian asked. He said it softly, genuinely curious, as if her sentence were a door he wanted to open. She looked at him. She looked at the room full of men who had known Lucian for years and known her for the length of his parties. She understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once, that he had decided to do this here. Specifically here. Specifically now. In front of all of them. She had not prepared for tonight to be the night. She'd had a different timeline in her head, a few more weeks, certain papers not yet finalized, certain accounts not yet restructured. She was not as ready as she'd planned to be. She was also not unprepared. "I'll say this once," Lucian continued, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room. "If Elena wants to remain in this marriage, she can demonstrate that she values it. If she doesn't—" He gestured toward the front door with his glass. "There's the door." The silence thickened. "Beg me to keep you," he said, and he smiled. "Or walk." Elena stood very still for a moment. Somewhere behind her she heard someone, a man, let out a low, barely audible sound. Not quite a laugh. Almost a laugh. "I'll need a few minutes," she said. Lucian's smile broadened. He turned slightly to Briggs as if to say, "Watch this." Elena turned and walked toward the staircase. She climbed it without hurrying. She had walked up this staircase approximately 4,000 times in 9 years. She had a general sense of the geometry of the house in her body by now. The way the 5th step creaked slightly, the way the landing turned, the way the hallway stretched to the right toward the master suite. She walked it now without looking down, without touching the banister, like someone who had memorized a route and no longer needed the map. She went to the closet first. She had 2 suitcases on the upper shelf, the smaller ones, not the large travel bags. She'd put them there 8 months ago in a moment of quiet decision-making that she hadn't examined too closely at the time. She pulled them down now and placed them open on the bed. She moved quickly. Not frantically. There's a difference. She had not made a list exactly, but she had thought about this moment enough times that her hands knew what to reach for. Clothing, personal documents, the small leather case on the top shelf of the right side of the closet that contained the things she'd been holding privately for years. Her university degree, her original passport, a small photograph of her mother. Her hands were very steady. She did not allow herself to think about what was happening downstairs. She thought only about what she was putting into the bags. This, then this, then this. The methodical rhythm of it was almost calming. 14 minutes. That's how long it took. She zipped the second suitcase and stood up straight. In the mirror on the back of the closet door, she caught her own reflection. She looked, she thought, remarkably composed for a woman dismantling 9 years of her life. There was something around her eyes that she'd have to work on later, some tightness that hadn't been there an hour ago. But her face was still her face. Her jaw was set. She was still standing. Good enough. She picked up both suitcases and carried them to the top of the stairs. The house had been so quiet during those 14 minutes that she'd half expected the party to have dissolved, for people to have quietly left out of discomfort. But when she reached the landing and looked down, they were all still there. Every single one of them, standing approximately where she'd left them. Some had shifted, refilled glasses, moved toward walls, but no one had gone. They had stayed to watch. Of course they had. Elena descended the staircase with a suitcase in each hand. She crossed the foyer into the dining room. She reached into her jacket, the jacket she'd kept on all evening, which no one had remarked on, and withdrew the envelope. She placed it on the dining table. Inside were the divorce papers. Signed, dated, filed with her attorney 3 weeks prior, and prepared for exactly this use. She walked back through the foyer to the front door. Lucian was watching her. She could feel it. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the door, at the handle, and she reached for it. Elena. His voice. Different now. Something in it she hadn't heard before. Something that might have been, in some compressed and too late form, uncertainty. She opened the door. The cold hit her immediately. January in Chicago is not gentle. It came in through the collar of her jacket and down the back of her neck, and she thought, distantly, that she should have grabbed a heavier coat. She walked down the front steps. She didn't look back. Behind her, through the open door, she heard the silence of 50 people who had expected one thing and gotten another. She heard Margaret Delaney say something, very quietly, to the woman beside her. She heard Lucian say nothing at all. The door closed, not slammed, just closed, someone pulling it shut. And then there was only the night, the cold, the crunch of her heels on the frost-stiffened front walk, the distant sound of the lake. She got to the car. Her hands were completely steady on the keys. She drove. For the first 20 minutes, she felt nothing recognizable. Just the road, the cold seeping out of the seat slowly as the heater climbed, the orange glow of highway lights strobing past. Chicago at night from the expressway had always looked like something that wanted to be more alive than it was. All that light, all that motion, and underneath it, all that cold and stillness. By the time she reached the downtown exit, her hands had started to shake. She pulled off the expressway and parked on a side street near Michigan Avenue. She turned the heater all the way up. She gripped the steering wheel, and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her therapist had taught her before she'd stopped being able to afford a therapist who didn't know Lucian's last name. She gave herself exactly 7 minutes. She had allowed herself these 7 minutes in her planning. She hadn't known when they'd arrive, hadn't known what form they'd take, but she had known they would come, and she had built them into her mental budget like a line item. 7 minutes of not being okay. Then move. Used 6. On the other side of the city, the penthouse was waiting. She had purchased it 4 months ago through a corporate entity called Stratford Holdings, LLC, which had no connection to any name Lucian would recognize. It was a good apartment, not extravagant, but real, solid, with south-facing windows and enough space to breathe. She had furnished it carefully and quietly, a few pieces at a time, over 3 months. She had spent exactly 1 night there, a test run she'd called it to herself, to make sure she could sleep in a place that was completely her own. She had slept like a stone. She drove the rest of the way in silence, no music, just the sound of the city and the heat and her own breathing. She parked in the building's underground garage and carried her 2 suitcases to the elevator. The elevator brought her to the 31st floor. The hallway was quiet. The door unlocked with her key code. She went inside. She set the suitcases down in the entrance and turned on the lights. It was exactly as she'd left it. She stood there for a moment in her dress and her too thin jacket and her heels, in the middle of an apartment that was entirely hers, in a life that was, finally, after 9 years, entirely hers. And then she exhaled. She'd been holding that breath longer than tonight. She understood that now. She'd been holding it for years. She changed her clothes. She made tea. She sat in the chair by the south window with the mug warming both hands and looked at the city spread below her. All that light, all that motion, all those millions of lives continuing without anyone's permission. And she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than either. She'd done it. It was after midnight when she finally moved toward the bedroom. At 2:47 in the morning, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. In the logic of everything that had just happened, she almost set it face down on the nightstand and let it go. But something, she would wonder about this later, many times. Something made her pick up. She said nothing. She listened. 3 words came through the line. A voice she didn't recognize. Flat, stripped of affect, delivered like a sentence being read from a document. They found Celeste. The line went dead. Elena sat up in the dark. She sat completely still for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. And then she was out of bed, phone in hand, heart doing something irregular and loud behind her sternum. Celeste Arden. The woman who had been, for 4 years, the quiet center of everything Elena had built in secret. Her financial strategist. The person who handled the architecture of Marlowe strategic partners, the accounts, the structures, the careful legal layering that kept Elena's professional life invisible to anyone looking through Lucian's eyes. Celeste was meticulous, private, paranoid, in all the right ways. She communicated through encrypted messaging. She never met Elena in any location connected to the Varelli name. She was invisible by design. If someone had found Celeste, it meant someone had been looking. And if someone had been looking, Elena was already dialing before the thought finished forming. The line rang twice. Then Celeste picked up, and Elena knew from the first syllable, tight, controlled, that particular register of a person actively managing their own fear, that it was worse than she'd hoped. "Tell me," Elena said. "Not on this line," Celeste said. "In person, tomorrow morning. The coffee place on Wabash." "Celeste, tomorrow morning." A pause. Then, "Elena, I need you to understand something. This started before tonight. Whoever is looking, they weren't triggered by what happened at the party. They were already looking. This has been going on for a while." The call ended. Elena stood in the dark of her new apartment, this apartment she had purchased and furnished and prepared as an escape, and she absorbed what Celeste had just told her. Someone had been watching her before tonight, before the party, before the ultimatum, before the suitcases and the divorce papers and the walk out into the cold. Lucian had known, or suspected. The public humiliation, beg me, or walk, had not been just cruelty. It had been a test, a calibration. He'd wanted to see what she would do. He'd wanted to see if she'd fold or run. He'd wanted to see what her response would reveal. And she had walked out. She had shown him her hand before she was ready. Elena set the phone down on the nightstand. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was dealing with. Not for long, not to be crushed by it, but because she had learned years ago that refusing to acknowledge something doesn't make it smaller. It just makes it unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things trip you in the dark. She felt the fear. She sat with it for exactly the time it needed. Then she picked the phone back up and opened her notes application. She typed 3 words. New timeline. Accelerate. Then she lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling of her apartment, the apartment that was hers, that no one had given her, that she had earned and paid for and chosen, and she made herself breathe slowly. She did not sleep much, but she did not fall apart either. In the morning, she would meet Celeste. She would find out the shape of what was coming toward her. She would make decisions. Tonight, for the few hours of dark remaining, she would let herself be exactly where she was. In a room no one could take from her, in a life she had built one invisible brick at a time. The city glowed beyond the curtains. Elena closed her eyes. The work she had once written at 22, in a notebook she no longer owned, is not proof of your worth. The worth was already there. She had believed it then. She had spent 9 years almost forgetting it. She believed it again now. The coffee place on Wabash was the kind of spot that didn't try to be anything. No exposed Edison bulbs. No chalkboard manifesto about single-origin beans. Just a narrow room with 8 tables, a counter staffed by a woman who'd been there since before the neighborhood changed, and the particular quiet of a place where people came to think rather than to be seen thinking. Elena arrived 7 minutes early. She took the table in the back corner facing the door. She ordered black coffee and did not look at her phone while she waited. Celeste came in at 8:03, moving fast for someone who looked like she hadn't slept. She was 51, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that people frequently underestimated. Plain features, no jewelry, a coat that had been practical rather than chosen. People who underestimated Celeste Arden tended not to repeat the mistake. She sat down. She didn't take off her coat. "How bad?" Elena said. "Bad enough that I took a cab here instead of the train." Celeste wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the waitress set in front of her without either of them acknowledging the transaction. "Someone has been running a background trace on Marlowe's strategic partners for at least 6 weeks, maybe longer." "Professional?" "Very. Not law enforcement. The methodology is wrong for that. Private sector. Someone who knows what they're doing and has access to resources that aren't cheap." She paused. "And someone who knew exactly which thread to pull." Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the front window, a delivery truck groaned past on Wabash, rattling the glass in its frame. "They went through the incorporation records," Celeste continued. "Standard approach. You start with the public filings and work backward. Marlowe's strategic is clean, the layering held. But whoever this is, they didn't stop at Marlowe. They cross-referenced. They went looking for patterns. Shared vendors, overlapping addresses, registration dates." She looked at Elena directly. "They found the Dunmore account." Elena set down her coffee mug. The Dunmore account was a subsidiary of a subsidiary, a consulting fee structure that Celeste had established 3 years ago to route income from Elena's 3 largest clients without any direct connection to her name. It was not illegal. It was meticulous. It was also the closest thing to a footprint Elena had left. "How?" Elena asked. "One of the vendor invoices from 2022 had a billing address that matched a property registered to a holding company you used for the Streeterville purchase." Celeste's voice didn't carry blame. It was just data. "It was one match, but it was enough for someone who was already looking." "And you think this is Lucian?" Celeste's expression said she thought the question was almost too simple. "I think Lucian hired someone very good and gave them very specific instructions. I think that happened before last night, which means—" "The party wasn't spontaneous," Elena finished. "No." They sat with that for a moment. The coffee between them steamed. A man at the counter laughed at something on his phone. "He suspected something," Elena said. "He didn't know how much. He was trying to shake something loose." "And you walked out," Celeste said. Not accusatory, just stating it. "I walked out," Elena confirmed, "which tells him you had somewhere to go." "Yes." Celeste leaned forward slightly. "Elena, if he accelerates, if he gets his attorney involved before you've restructured the remaining accounts—" "I know." "The Dunmore account alone—" "I know, Celeste." A beat. Celeste leaned back. She picked up her coffee and drank. She was the kind of person who could communicate an enormous amount of worry through very small gestures, and right now her posture alone was doing significant work. "The caller last night," Elena said. "The one who warned me. Unknown number. 3 words and gone." "I've been thinking about that." "Do you have any idea—" "No," Celeste said. "But that kind of warning, delivered that way, that fast. It's someone inside. Someone who knew the investigator had made progress and wanted you to know before morning. That's not a stranger. That's someone with access to Lucian's operation." Elena turned her coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. She was thinking, and she let herself think, and she didn't fill the silence with anything that wasn't useful. "I need 48 hours, she said finally. "You have maybe 72 before the investigator files his first consolidated report, and Lucian decides what to do with it. Then I need to move faster than he does." Celeste nodded. It wasn't approval exactly. It was the nod of someone who'd agreed to get into a car and was now watching the road ahead and understanding the speed was going to be what it needed to be, regardless of comfort. "I'll start restructuring the Dunmore accounts today," Celeste said. "I'll need you to authorize the transfers through the secondary signatory." "Done." "What about the property in Oak Park?" "Still clean. That one's fine." "The investment portfolio?" The Robertson Holdings positions are protected. Those I'm not worried about. Celeste hesitated. It's the operating accounts for Marlowe Strategic itself that I want to move. The business income. If Lucian's attorney subpoenas, move it, Elena said. All of it. Wherever you think is safest. Celeste looked at her. That's aggressive. He humiliated me in front of 50 people last night and had someone investigating my finances before he did it, Elena said. I'm comfortable with aggressive. Celeste held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. All right. They finished their coffee. They did not hug when they left. They never did. But Celeste touched Elena's arm briefly at the door, which was its own language, and then walked north toward the L. And Elena stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the January cold and let the enormity of the next 72 hours settle around her like weather. She had work to do. She turned south and started walking. She did not look at her reflection in the storefront windows as she passed. Declan Rourke got the call at 9:17 that same morning while he was on his second cup of coffee in his office on the 14th floor of a building on LaSalle that had the kind of deliberately unremarkable lobby designed to ensure nobody remembered having been there. He was 44, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been physically imposing and had let the imposing part expand sideways with the years. His office contained a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with an actual lock on it, and nothing else. No diplomas on the wall, no photographs, nothing that told you who he was, because the kind of clients Declan Rourke served preferred it that way. Lucian Varelli's voice on his phone sounded like it had been compressed overnight, tight, contained, carrying the specific energy of a man who had spent 8 hours being very angry in private and had now achieved the dangerous calm on the other side of that. Tell me where you are, Lucian said. Dunmore account, Declan said. Possibly further. How far is possibly further? Declan leaned back in his chair. I need another week to give you a complete picture. What I can tell you right now is that your wife has been running an active professional operation under a corporate structure completely separate from anything with your name on it. Multiple entities, multiple income streams, real estate. It's not a hobby account, Lucian. Someone built this carefully over several years. The silence on the other end of the line had texture. Declan had been doing this long enough to read silences, and this one told him a specific thing. Lucian had suspected, but the confirmation was hitting differently than he'd expected it to. How much? Lucian asked. Revenue? I don't have clean numbers yet. What I can tell you is that the investment portfolio positions alone suggest how much? Declan paused. 7 figures. Possibly 8 once we get into the full structure. Another silence. Longer this time. I want everything, Lucian said. Every company, every account, every property. I want names, everyone she worked with, her attorney, her accountant, anyone. I'll have a preliminary report by Friday. Thursday. Declan didn't argue. Thursday. The call ended. He set the phone down and looked at the window for a moment, at the gray Chicago sky doing nothing interesting above the LaSalle Street canyons, and then he pulled up his current working files and began adjusting his timeline. He did not particularly enjoy working for Lucian Varelli. The man paid well and paid promptly, but there was something exhausting about clients who used information as a weapon rather than a decision-making tool. Declan had done enough of these: domestic investigations, marital asset tracing, the unglamorous cartography of people coming apart, to know the difference between someone who wanted facts and someone who wanted ammunition. Lucian wanted ammunition. The wife, though. He'd been at this for 6 weeks, and the more he pulled on her threads, the more he found himself with a reluctant professional respect for what she'd built. It was clean. It was intelligent. There was almost no ego in it, no unnecessary complexity, no showing off, nothing done to be impressive. Just careful, consistent architecture over time. He pulled up the file on Celeste Arden and stared at it for a moment. Then he picked up the phone again. He had another call to make. One Lucian didn't know about. Vincent Caruso had been with Lucian Varelli for 23 years. He was 63, gray all the way through now, with a face that had done a lot of work getting to where it was. He walked with a slight forward tilt, an old back injury from a car accident in 2009 that he'd never fully corrected, and he wore the same kind of dark wool coats he'd been wearing since before Lucian had money enough to care what his people wore. He sat now in a booth at a diner in Wicker Park, a place he'd been coming to for years because the owner's family owed him a kindness from a long time ago, and because nobody in Lucian's circle would think to look for him here. He was staring at a plate of eggs he hadn't touched. On the table beside the plate was his phone. He'd turned it face down 20 minutes ago and hadn't touched it since. He was thinking about last night. He'd been at the party. He'd stood in that room and watched Lucian Varelli tell his wife, in front of federal judges and aldermen and contractors and half the people whose good opinion ran the machinery of half the city, to beg him to stay married to her. He'd watched Elena Marlowe Varelli set down her champagne glass and go upstairs. He'd watched the room hold its breath, and then he'd watched her come back down with 2 suitcases and walk out the front door without a word to anyone, divorce papers left on the table like a receipt. He'd spent 23 years watching Lucian do things he didn't entirely agree with. That was the job. That was what loyalty meant inside an organization like this. You held your opinions behind your teeth, you did your work, and you understood that the man at the top made the calls and your role was to execute rather than to evaluate. He'd believed that for a long time. I wasn't sure he believed it anymore. He picked up his fork, put it down again. He thought about the anonymous call he'd made at 2:47 in the morning. He had gotten Declan's preliminary report forwarded to him through a contact. Lucian included Vincent in operational briefings, or had until recently, and he'd read it at 2 in the morning in his home office with a glass of whiskey that sat untouched while he worked through what he was reading. She had built something real, something serious, something that had nothing to do with Lucian's money or Lucian's name or any of the infrastructure she was surrounded by in that mansion. She had done it quietly, over years, while playing the role of the obedient wife with what he now understood had been a performance of considerable skill. He had made the call because it was the right thing to do. He was aware that this was not a safe thing to believe inside his own head, let alone act on. His phone buzzed face down on the table. He turned it over. Declan Rourke's name. He stared at it for 2 rings, then picked up. "Vincent," Declan said. His voice was careful. Declan's voice was always careful, but this was a specific kind of careful. "I need to ask you something directly." "Ask." "Did you contact Elena Varelli last night?" The diner around him continued to exist. A couple arguing quietly in the booth across the room, the short-order cook rattling something behind the counter, the particular low-level noise of a weekday morning in a neighborhood that was always between things. Vincent picked up his coffee. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because someone did," Declan said. "And the timing means it was someone who had access to my preliminary findings before Lucian knew I'd found anything significant, which means it was someone inside." Vincent drank his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. "Lucian is going to ask me the same question," Declan said. "Not a threat, just a statement of the landscape." "I know," Vincent said. "Vincent, I know." He set the mug down. "What do you need from me?" A pause on the other end. Then Declan said with what sounded like genuine fatigue, "Nothing. I needed to ask. Now I know." Another pause. "For what it's worth, I think whoever made that call made the right call." The line went quiet. Vincent sat alone in the booth with his cold coffee and his untouched eggs and the knowledge that the clock on his 23 years of loyalty had just started its final countdown. The week that followed moved in contradictions. On its surface, the city continued its January indifference. The lake froze at the edges. The wind came off the water in the mornings with its characteristic personal malice. People moved through it with their heads down and their shoulders up, existing with the city's cold the way you exist with a difficult relative at a holiday dinner, managing, enduring, privately counting the hours. Underneath the surface of that ordinary week, Elena moved like someone diffusing something. She spent 16 hours a day working, not the way she'd been working inside Lucian's world, the managed, visible, careful performance of productivity. This was different. This was the real thing, and she felt the difference in her body the way you feel the difference between walking on ice and walking on solid ground. Same motion, different certainty underfoot. Celeste restructured the Dunmore accounts in 31 hours. She was meticulous, and she was fast, and when Elena asked if she'd slept, she said enough, in a tone that made clear the conversation was complete. Elena's attorney, a woman named Patricia Hollis, whose office was in a building on Michigan Avenue that communicated the particular kind of understated seriousness that meant nobody inside needed to prove anything, reviewed the financial disclosure documents, and looked at Elena across the desk with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally something else. "You built all of this during the marriage," Patricia said. "Yes." "While maintaining no visible professional profile." "That was intentional." Patricia looked at the documents for a moment. "He's going to claim it as marital property." "I know. His argument will be that any income generated during the marriage—" "I know the argument, Patricia." Elena kept her voice even. "What I need to know is our counter." "The counter," Patricia said carefully, "depends significantly on how you want to play this. If you want to protect the business quietly, we continue the current approach. Keep the structure opaque, fight the subpoena on discovery, delay. If you want to go on offense," she paused, "you disclose everything voluntarily, first, before he can characterize it as concealment." Elena looked at her. "It sounds counterintuitive," Patricia said, "but if you disclose it yourself, with full documentation, with a clear narrative of how you built it, your education, your clients, your professional track record, it transforms the story. It's no longer secret assets he uncovered. It's your company that you disclosed openly. And it neutralizes the concealment argument." "Significantly, yes." Patricia took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. "It also means everything becomes visible. Whatever he does with that information—" "He was going to find it anyway," Elena said. "Declan Rourke doesn't miss things." "No," Patricia agreed. "He doesn't." Elena stood and walked to the window. Michigan Avenue was 40 floors below, and from up here it had the quality of a model. Everything precise, everything small, everything moving according to patterns she could almost trace. She had spent 4 years building invisible infrastructure. She had constructed a life that existed in the shadow of Lucian's name, unseen, protected by its invisibility. And now she was being asked to step into the light and show it to the people who wanted to take it from her. Everything in her resisted that, and everything in her understood that Patricia was right. "File the disclosure," Elena said, without turning from the window. "Complete accounting, everything." "Elena, do it before Thursday." She turned back. "Before Declan finishes his report and Lucian's attorney starts the clock." Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and picked up her pen. Elena Marlowe found out what he had done in pieces. He was 38, and he was the kind of man who had never quite caught up to the version of himself he'd intended to become. He'd had real talent once, a facility for numbers, for patterns, for seeing the architecture underneath things. And he'd spent a decade and a half slowly trading that talent for short-term relief in the form of a gambling habit that had grown from a weekend thing to the central organizing fact of his life. He owed money to people who did not extend credit on the basis of good faith. 2 years ago, when those debts had reached a number that made him physically ill to think about, a man he didn't know had come to find him. The man had a name he never used and an offer that was simple: information about his sister's financial activities, delivered periodically, in exchange for debt relief and ongoing payments. Elliot had told himself it was harmless. Elena was fine. She was Lucian Varelli's wife, she lived in a mansion, she had more resources than she'd ever need. He was just passing along publicly available information, business registration documents, vendor details. Nothing that could really hurt her. He had been lying to himself so fluently for so many years that he'd almost believed it. The morning after the party, he sat in his apartment in Logan Square, a place that had once been nice and was now a kind of testament to the gravity of his choices, and he watched the news he'd already known was coming. Elena had walked out of Lucian's party, divorce papers had been filed, Lucian Varelli was reportedly furious. He sat on the edge of his bed with his phone in his hands, and he understood, finally, completely, and with the particular clarity that comes when it is too late, what he had actually done. He hadn't been providing harmless business information. He had been handing the man his sister was trying to escape the map to her escape route. He sat there for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. He didn't call Elena, he wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't ready to hear from him, and he knew it. Instead, he pulled up the encrypted messaging application he'd been using to communicate with the intermediary, and he typed a single message. "I'm done. Don't contact me again." He turned his phone off. He sat in the silence of his apartment for another hour. Then he got up, made himself coffee, and sat at his kitchen table and began writing the first of what he understood would need to be many difficult truths. He didn't know yet if Elena would ever speak to him again. He suspected she probably shouldn't, but he was going to tell her what he'd done before someone else did. It was Vincent who broke first. Not broke in the way of collapse. Vincent wasn't built for collapse. He broke in the way of a man who had finally crossed a line he'd been approaching for years, and then looked back and saw exactly how far he'd come from where he started. He asked to meet Lucian on Wednesday afternoon in the private office on the second floor of the State Street property. Not the North Shore mansion, which Lucian was using less since the party, but the downtown space he kept for the kind of conversations that needed different geography. Lucian was behind the desk when Vincent came in. He looked terrible, which was the most notable thing, because Lucian Varelli almost never looked terrible. He'd always had the particular physical resilience of men who believed in their own centrality to events. They tended to metabolize stress as energy, redirect it outward. But the past week had done something to his face that he hadn't been able to redirect. He looked like a man who'd discovered he'd been wrong about something that mattered and hadn't yet found a way to make that fact useful. "You wanted to talk," Lucian said. Vincent sat down without being invited to. Another small thing that registered. "I'm going to tell you something," Vincent said. "And I'm going to tell you because 23 years means I owe you honesty before I owe you anything else." Lucian's eyes narrowed. Something in his posture changed, a subtle recalibration, the way a man positions himself when he senses the terrain is about to shift. "I made a phone call," Vincent said, "the night of the party. I warned Elena that Declan had found something." The silence in the room was complete. Lucian didn't move. He looked at Vincent with an expression that Vincent had seen maybe 3 times in 23 years. Not anger, which was common and manageable, but something underneath anger, something colder and more structural, like the foundation of a building revealing a crack. "You warned her," Lucian said. "Yes. My wife." "Your soon-to-be ex-wife," Vincent said. He kept his voice steady. "And yes, I warned her." Lucian stood up from behind the desk. He didn't come around it, just stood behind it, which in its own way was more menacing than anything physical might have been. "After 23 years, Lucian said, you did this." "After 23 years, Vincent said, I watched you humiliate her in front of 50 people who will remember it for the rest of their lives. I watched you treat her like she was something you owned rather than someone you married, and I decided—" He paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing the words carefully. "I decided I was done being part of that." "You don't get to make that call," Lucian said. "I already made it." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of a moment that knows it's significant, that has no ambient noise to hide in. Lucian looked at him for a long time. "Get out," he said finally. "Don't come back." Vincent stood. He nodded, once to himself rather than to Lucian, and then he walked to the door and opened it and didn't look back. Behind him, he heard Lucian pick up the phone. He was calling Declan, most likely, or his attorney, setting new machinery in motion. Vincent took the elevator to the lobby and walked out onto State Street, into the January cold, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment while the city moved around him. He breathed. The air tasted like exhaust and cold water, and the particular mineral sharpness of winter in a place that didn't soften for weather. He had just ended 23 years of his life in 4 minutes. He started walking. He didn't have a plan yet, but he felt, underneath the very real fear of what came next, something he hadn't felt in longer than he could accurately recall. He felt clean. Patricia filed the voluntary disclosure on Thursday morning at 8:47 a.m. Elena sat in her Streeterville apartment and watched the timestamp confirm on her laptop and felt her own heartbeat in her temples, and understood that there was no version of the next several months that was going to be comfortable or easy or safe. She had just handed Lucian a complete picture of everything she'd built. She had done it before he could frame it as something she'd hidden. She had done it because it was the right tactical decision and because she was tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, of living inside someone else's understanding of who she was. At 9:23 a.m., her phone rang. Patricia. "His attorney called," Patricia said. 12 minutes after the filing. They are—" a small pause. "Unhappy." "Good," Elena said. "He wants a meeting. Lucian does, in person, just the two of them, no attorneys." Elena stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The lake was out there, gray and enormous and indifferent to all of this. "No," she said. That's what I told them. He gets a meeting, Elena said, when he agrees to formal settlement negotiations with both legal teams present. That's the only room I'm walking into with him. They'll push back. Let them push, Elena said. She hung up. She stood at the window for a moment, then her phone buzzed again, a different number this time, one she recognized. She almost didn't answer. She stood there for 2 full rings with her thumb over the screen, and then she answered because she was past the point of avoiding things that were going to need to be faced. Elliot, she said. Her brother's voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who had been rehearsing for a long time and had finally accepted that rehearsal wasn't going to be enough. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to know that I know there's nothing I can say that makes it okay. Elena pressed her back against the window. The cold glass came through her shirt. Then say it, she said, and the last piece fell into place. The first thing Elena did after she hung up with Elliot was nothing. She stood with her back against the cold window glass, and she did nothing for exactly 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because the digital clock on the stove was visible from where she stood, and she watched the numbers change twice, and both times the change felt like something physical, like a door closing in sequence. Then she walked to the kitchen table and sat down and placed her phone face up in front of her and looked at it. Elliot had told her everything: the meeting with the intermediary, the debt, the documents he had photographed, the specific files. She knew which ones the moment he described them. She knew because she remembered the night she had left those files on her home desk for 40 minutes while she took a call. 40 minutes she had always considered safe because Lucian had been in Milwaukee and the house staff had the evening off. 40 minutes that had apparently been enough. He had photographed the preliminary incorporation documents for Marlowe Strategic Partners, the ones showing her signature alongside the registered agents, the ones that, alone, proved nothing, but in the hands of someone already looking, would have been the first thread worth pulling. He had handed Lucian that thread 2 years ago. 2 years. She sat at the kitchen table and turned this fact over in her mind, the way you turn something broken in your hands, trying to understand the exact mechanics of how it failed. 2 years meant the entire second phase of her planning. The Dunmore account, the Streeterville purchase, the investment positioning, had been conducted under at least partial surveillance. Not complete, not comprehensive, but partial. Partial was enough to be dangerous. Her brother had cried on the phone. She had not responded to the crying, not because she was without feeling. She was full of feeling, was in fact so full of it that she couldn't locate any one emotion cleanly, everything pressing against everything else. But because responding to his grief felt like the wrong direction of energy right now. His grief was real. It was also not the problem she had to solve. She had told him one thing before hanging up. Don't contact me again until I reach out to you. Do you understand? He had said yes. She had hung up. Now she picked up the phone and called Celeste. Celeste answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. How much of what he gave them, Elena said, overlaps with what we've already restructured? A pause. Celeste was clearly already thinking through it. The incorporation documents he described, those are incorporated into the original Marlowe strategic filing, which is already part of the voluntary disclosure we filed this morning. So they already have it. They were going to have it anyway, Celeste said. Declan would have found the original filings through public records within the week, regardless of what Elliot gave them. That's not the point, Elena said. Celeste was quiet for a moment. I know that's not the point. The point was that someone inside Elena's actual life, not a stranger, not a professional investigator, working from the outside but her own blood, had been feeding information to the man she was trying to escape. The point was that the safety she had felt during those years of careful building had been, in some meaningful percentage, an illusion. The point was that she had been watched from closer than she'd known, and the watching had happened through a door she had left unlocked because she had believed, had needed to believe, that some people were simply not capable of certain betrayals. She had been wrong. There's something else, Celeste said. Elena's grip on the phone tightened slightly. She recognized Celeste's tone. It was the tone of someone delivering a second piece of bad news who is aware that the first piece has not yet fully landed. Tell me. Declan filed his preliminary report this morning. I have a contact at the county recorder's office. She flagged something. He cross-referenced the Streeterville building's ownership records against a list of corporate entities connected to the Dunmore account. A pause. Elena? He found the penthouse. He knows where you're living. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena looked at the south-facing window. Through it, the city. The lake. The specific geometry of the view she had chosen carefully, privately, as the first thing that would be entirely hers. "When did the filing go in?" she asked. 9:40 this morning, approximately 50 minutes after Patricia filed the voluntary disclosure, which meant Lucian had known about the penthouse for at least part of the morning, which meant the phone call Patricia had received from his attorney at 9:23 had happened with that knowledge already in hand. He had known where she was sleeping when he asked for the meeting. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the city that stretched below her, and she made herself breathe and she made herself think rather than feel, because feeling was a thing she could do later and thinking was a thing she needed to do right now. "I need you to listen carefully," Elena said. "Is the Streeterville purchase clean, legally clean, all the way through?" "Yes." "Stratford Holdings is airtight. The purchase is completely legitimate. So he knows where I live, but he can't do anything about it." "Not legally, no." "Then it's information he has that changes nothing except my comfort level." She said it firmly, mostly to herself. "Which is not a legal problem. It's a psychological one." "Elena, I'm fine." She said it before Celeste could finish. Then, more honestly, "I'm not fine, but I will be. What do I need to do in the next 6 hours?" Celeste ran through it. Account transfers needing secondary authorization. A document request from Patricia requiring Elena's sign-off. A client call for Marlowe Strategic that had been scheduled 2 weeks ago and was now going to require Elena to sit in a room and perform professional competence, while her personal life was actively on fire. Elena wrote everything down. She did the client call at noon from her kitchen table. She was 20 minutes early, she had reviewed the relevant files, and she spent 57 minutes discussing a restructuring proposal for a mid-sized logistics company in Cincinnati, with the kind of focused clarity that would have surprised anyone who'd seen her face at 10 a.m. It didn't surprise Celeste, who listened to the recording later and noted, with something approaching awe, that Elena's voice had been completely steady throughout. After the call ended, Elena went to the bathroom, turned on the shower, got in fully clothed, sat on the floor of the shower stall, and let the water run over her for 6 minutes. Then she got up, changed her clothes, and went back to work. Lucian's attorney was a man named Howard Fitch, who had been practicing family law and corporate litigation in Chicago for 31 years, and who had, over that time, developed a particular skill for identifying which side of a case had more to lose. He had the manner of a very patient reptile, unhurried, unrattled, content to wait in whatever position he was in for as long as necessary. He called Patricia Hollis at 2 in the afternoon. Patricia put the call on speaker with Elena present, which Howard either didn't know or didn't mind. "Your client's voluntary disclosure is interesting," Howard said. He made the word interesting carry a specific weight. "It's also complete," Patricia said. "Every account, every entity, every property. Clean documentation for all of it." "We're still reviewing the scope," Howard said pleasantly. "There are some questions about the operational timeline of Marlowe Strategic Partners. Specifically, questions about income generated during the marriage and whether the corporate structure was designed to—" "The corporate structure," Patricia said, "was designed to operate a legitimate consulting business, which it has done. There is no allegation available to you that survives contact with the actual documentation." "We'll see," Howard said. "We will. What I'm calling to discuss," Howard continued, shifting with the smoothness of long practice, "is Mr. Varelli's position regarding the marital estate. He's prepared to make an offer." Elena and Patricia looked at each other across the desk. "We're listening," Patricia said. "Mr. Varelli would agree to an accelerated settlement timeline in exchange for a 50% stake in Marlowe Strategic Partners. Given that the business was built using marital time and, potentially, marital resources, he believes this is a fair—" "No," Patricia said. "Reasonable. No. Next offer." A brief pause. "Ms. Hollis, your client's position is not as strong as she may believe. The discovery process alone—" "If Mr. Varelli wants discovery," Patricia said, "he's welcome to it. My client voluntarily disclosed this morning. Everything is already on the table. What exactly does he think he's going to find that changes the numbers?" "That's a question," Howard said, "for the discovery process to answer." After the call ended, Elena sat in the chair across from Patricia's desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 50%, she said. It's an opening position, Patricia said. It's meant to be insulting. It is insulting. It's also a signal that he doesn't actually know what he has yet. If Declan's report were comprehensive, Howard wouldn't be fishing with an opener like that. Patricia folded her hands on the desk. He's trying to scare you into settling cheap before he knows the real number. Elena looked at her. What do you think the real number is? Honestly. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Honestly? I think there's a genuine legal argument about income generated during the marriage. Not an overwhelming one, your documentation is strong, but real enough that a judge could go different ways. The question is whether you want to fight it for 2 years and spend half of what you'd lose in legal fees, or whether you want to find a number that ends it. He wants the company, Elena said. He wants something he can say he took from you, Patricia said. It was blunt, and it was accurate, and Elena appreciated that Patricia didn't dress it in softer language. He's not getting the company, Elena said. Then we fight. We fight, Elena said. She left Patricia's office at 4 o'clock and stood on Michigan Avenue in the January cold and called Celeste and relayed the conversation and listened while Celeste worked through the implications with the rapid mental arithmetic that Elena had come to depend on. She was standing on the sidewalk in that conversation when the black car pulled up. She saw it before it stopped. The kind of car that costs enough to communicate that the person inside doesn't need to hurry. It stopped at the curb 10 feet from where she was standing, and the rear window lowered, and she found herself looking at Lucian Varelli for the first time since she had walked out of his front door. He looked worse than she'd expected. Not physically destroyed, his suit was right, his bearing was controlled, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Some scaffolding was missing. He looked like a building that was technically still standing but had lost something load-bearing. Celeste, Elena said quietly into the phone, I'll call you back. She hung up. She and Lucian looked at each other across the 10 feet of freezing sidewalk. This isn't a meeting, he said through the window. I just need a minute. You have less than that, Elena said. He got out of the car. His driver stayed inside. Lucian came around the open door and stood on the sidewalk and put his hands in his coat pockets, and the gesture made him look briefly like someone who was not sure what to do with his body. That was new. The disclosure, he said. You're filing this morning. My attorney handles my filings. Elena. His voice dropped. Something happened in it. She couldn't fully identify it, and she didn't trust herself to, because her interpretive tools for Lucian's voice had been calibrated over 9 years of a specific dynamic, and she was in the process of recalibrating everything. I had Declan's full report by this afternoon. She waited. It's... He stopped. Looked at the street. A cab went by. A woman with a stroller forced them both to step slightly closer to the building behind them. It's more than I understood. Yes, she said. How long were you... He stopped again. Started differently. When did you start? She looked at him. He was asking genuinely. She could see it. That was the most disorienting thing. She could see that the question was real. Before the 3rd year, she said, after the Brennan dinner. He knew which dinner. She watched him know which dinner. The Brennan dinner had been in the 2nd year of their marriage, a fundraiser for a state senator, and at some point during the evening, Lucian had made a joke at her expense in front of the senator's wife that had been framed as fond and had landed differently. He probably hadn't thought about that night in years. Elena had thought about it considerably. I didn't... He started. Lucian. She said his name clearly. Not harshly, just clearly. Don't do this on a sidewalk. Your attorney knows where to reach mine. She started to turn. His hand closed around her arm. Not hard. Not violently. But it was there, his grip, and the presence of it, the presumption of it. The old automatic assumption that he had the right to stop her from going where she was going moved through her like electricity. She turned back slowly. She looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at his face. Remove your hand, she said. The words came out very quiet. Quieter than she'd intended, but something in the quietness made them land harder than volume would have. He released her. He looked, for just a moment, in a way he couldn't fully control, like a man who had just understood something about himself that he hadn't been prepared to understand. See you in court, Elena said. She walked away. She made it to the elevator of the parking garage on the next block before her hands started shaking. She stood in the elevator with her back against the metal wall and gripped her own wrists and breathed and felt the shaking move through her palms and fingers, and she did not try to stop it. She let it happen. She gave it the time it needed. The elevator reached the 3rd level. She walked to her car. She got in. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel and breathed. 3 minutes. Then she started the engine. Declan Rourke delivered his full report to Lucian on Thursday evening. It was 47 pages. Lucian read it in 2 hours, alone in the State Street office, with a glass of scotch that he refilled once and then left alone. He read it the way you read something you're hoping will tell you one thing and keeps telling you another. The report was thorough. It detailed the structure of Marlowe's strategic partners, its client list, its revenue over 4 years, its corporate architecture. It mapped the properties. It identified Celeste Arden and outlined her professional relationship with Elena. It traced the investment portfolio positions. And it showed, in the kind of dispassionate financial language that Declan used because he had learned that the facts themselves were damaging enough without dramatization, the scale of what Elena had built. 7 years into a marriage with a man who paid for everything and controlled everything and believed himself to be the singular economic fact of her existence, she had quietly become her own singular economic fact. Lucian set the report down after the 2nd hour. He sat in the office that he used for conversations that needed different geography, and he looked at the far wall and he did something he had not done in a very long time. He thought about his wife, not about the divorce, not about the litigation, not about what he could take or what he could expose. He thought about Elena Marlowe Varelli, the specific person, the woman who had organized his parties and managed his households and played the role he required with a precision he had never examined, because examining it would have required curiosity, and curiosity would have required him to believe she was worth being curious about. He had not believed that. Not really. Not underneath the performance of affection, not underneath the things you say in a marriage because you're supposed to say them. He had treated her like furniture. He knew this. He had known it, in some compressed and infrequently visited corner of himself, for years. He had simply decided that the thing you treated someone like was less important than whether they stayed. He picked up the scotch. He drank. He thought about Vincent. Vincent, who had given 23 years and had walked out after 4 minutes of honesty. Vincent, who had made a phone call in the middle of the night because watching Lucian humiliate his wife had finally exceeded whatever internal threshold Vincent had maintained across 2 decades. Vincent, who had told him the truth directly and to his face and taken the consequence without visible fear. He thought about the things Vincent had said. I was done being part of that. He put the glass down. He picked up Declan's report again and turned to the final section, which contained a timeline Declan had reconstructed. Approximate dates of when certain accounts were opened, when certain properties were acquired, when the structural pieces of Elena's financial life had been put in place. He had been married to this woman. He had shared meals with her for 9 years. He had slept in the same bed. And he had not known her at all. Not because she had hidden herself with such perfect skill that knowing her was impossible, but because he had never bothered to look. Because looking would have required considering that she might be worth knowing. The report in his hands was 47 pages of the thing he had refused to see. He set it down again. He sat for a while longer. Then he picked up his phone and called Howard Fitch. I want to change the settlement approach, he said. Howard was quiet for a moment. Lucian, the 50% demand, withdraw it. If we withdraw it now, before discovery, withdraw it, Lucian said, and schedule a full settlement meeting, both legal teams. I want to sit across from her myself. Another pause. That's unusual? Schedule it, Lucian said. He ended the call. He sat alone in the office. Outside, Chicago continued doing what it did in January, grinding, cold, indifferent, alive. The kind of city that didn't wait for you to be ready before it kept moving. Elena got the call from Patricia on Friday morning. His attorney wants to schedule a settlement meeting, Patricia said. Full negotiation. Both teams present. And a small pause that carried something Elena couldn't quite read. Lucian wants to attend personally. Elena was standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee, still in the first 10 minutes of the day, which was typically the 10 minutes before she allowed the weight of everything to fully descend. The weight descended immediately. He wants to sit in the room, she said. That's the request. She thought about the sidewalk on Michigan Avenue, his hand on her arm, the way his face had looked when she'd told him to remove it. "When?" she asked. "They propose next Thursday. 42nd floor conference room at the Sterling Building on Michigan." She knew the building. She had walked past it 100 times. She had never been inside it. "Tell them yes," she said. "Elena, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Tell them yes." She hung up and stood at the counter with her coffee cooling between her hands, and looked at the south-facing window and the city beyond it, and thought about what it meant to walk into a room with Lucian Varelli when both of them knew, fully and without pretense, exactly who she was now. She had spent 4 years becoming someone he didn't know existed. In 1 week she had disclosed that person to the world. She was terrified. She was also done being afraid of his version of her. But there was one more thing. One piece she had not yet dealt with, not directly, not in the way it needed to be dealt with. She picked up her phone and opened her contacts and scrolled to the name she hadn't called in 2 years under circumstances that were anything other than careful and structured. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. Then, "Elena." Elliot's voice, hollowed out. The voice of someone who had been waiting. "I need you to do something," she said. "Anything. I need you to write down everything, everything you gave them, every meeting, every document, every conversation, dates, details, everything you can remember. And I need you to give it to my attorney." A long pause. "Why?" "Because if Lucian's team tries to use any of that information against me in the settlement negotiation, I need to be able to demonstrate how they obtained it, and I need it documented before Thursday." Another pause. Elena, that could expose me legally." "I know," she said. She waited. "Okay," Elliot said quietly. "Have it to Patricia's office by Tuesday," she said. She ended the call. She set the phone on the counter. She had 3 days before the settlement meeting. 3 days to prepare for a room that would contain the full, documented truth of who she had become and the man who had made becoming that truth necessary. She went to her desk. She opened her laptop. She began to work. But at 11:17 that morning, her phone rang again. Unknown number. The same category of unknown number as the 2:47 a.m. call that had started all of this. She answered immediately. "Ms. Varelli." A voice she didn't recognize. Male, middle-aged, flat affect. "My name is not something I'm going to give you. What I'm going to give you is a piece of information your attorney doesn't have yet." Her hand tightened on the phone. "I'm listening." Declan Rourke's full report has 47 pages in the version your attorney will receive through Discovery. There is a 48th page. It was removed before the official filing. She was very still. "What's on it?" she asked. "The name of the person who flagged the Dunmore account connection initially," the voice said. "Not Elena Marlowe. Someone else. Someone inside Celeste Arden's own office." The room went very quiet around her. "Inside Celeste's office," she repeated. "A junior analyst. Been there 8 months. Name is Marcus Webb." A pause. "He's been on Declan's payroll since before he was hired." The call ended. Elena stood in her kitchen with the phone at her side and the city spread outside her window and the particular sensation of the ground shifting underneath something she had believed was solid. Celeste's office. Not Elliot alone. Not just Lucian's investigator working from the outside. Someone inside. Someone embedded, deliberately, in the closest professional relationship Elena had. Someone who had been watching not just her finances, but the woman who protected her finances, who had seen the restructuring as it happened, who had watched the moves Elena made in the days after she walked out of Lucian's party, who had reported every adjustment in real time. She thought of Celeste at the coffee place on Wabash, the careful words, the tight control. Had Celeste known? She could not let herself answer that yet. She needed to find out first. She pulled up Celeste's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. And for the first time since she'd walked out of Lucian's front door, she was not certain who she could trust with the thing she was about to say. She did not call Celeste. She stood in the kitchen for 3 full minutes with her thumb over the call button, and then she put the phone face down on the counter and walked to the window and stood there until her breathing evened out enough to think clearly. The problem with calling Celeste was simple. If Celeste knew about Marcus Webb, then calling her would accomplish nothing except alerting her that Elena knew. And if Celeste didn't know, if Webb had been planted without her awareness, which was possible, which was even likely given how Declan operated, Then calling Celeste would send her straight to Webb before Elena had a chance to contain the damage. Either way, the call was wrong. She needed to know which version she was dealing with before she said a single word. She picked up the phone and called Patricia instead. Patricia answered on the second ring. "I need you to do something unusual," Elena said, "and I need you to do it in the next 2 hours." "Tell me." "I need you to run a background check on a junior analyst named Marcus Webb, currently employed at Celeste Arden's firm. Specifically, I need to know who hired him, when, and whether there are any financial connections between him and Declan Rourke's operation or anyone in Lucian's organization." A pause. "That's not unusual for me, but 2 hours is tight. Where did this name come from?" "An anonymous source." "Elena, the same category of source that warned Celeste had been found," Elena said, which turned out to be accurate. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, 2 hours? I'll call you." Elena hung up. She went to her desk. She opened the Marlowe strategic operating files, the client accounts, the current project timelines, the billing structures, and she worked through them with a focus that was partly genuine and partly the discipline of keeping her hands busy while her mind worked underneath the surface on the problem that actually mattered. At 12:47, Patricia called back. "Marcus Webb," Patricia said without preamble. 26 years old, finance background, hired by Celeste's firm 8 months ago through a staffing agency called Pinnacle Consulting Group. A pause. Pinnacle Consulting Group dissolved its corporate registration 6 weeks after Webb was placed. Its registered agent was a man named Thomas Gruder, who has a prior professional relationship with Declan Rourke going back to 2018. The connection was clean and direct. Elena's chest did something complicated. "Celeste didn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. She was working it through out loud. "There's no indication she did," Patricia said. "Pinnacle would have looked legitimate. Standard staffing operation, clean website, professional references. Unless she had specific reason to investigate the agency itself, she would have had no way of knowing." "Webb has been in her office for 8 months," Elena said. "Since before I walked out. Since before any of this became active." "Which means Declan planted him prospectively," Patricia said. "Before he knew what he was looking for. A precautionary asset. Someone in place in case your financial advisor became relevant." Which meant Lucian had been preparing for a longer time than Elena had understood. Not just weeks, months, possibly the better part of a year. He had suspected something was happening, something he couldn't see, and rather than confront it directly, he had seeded the landscape around her with someone patient enough to wait. She thought about the party, the ultimatum. Beg me or walk. He had not been testing whether she would leave. He had been testing whether she was ready to leave, whether her infrastructure was far enough along that she could actually survive without him. He'd wanted to see her fail, wanted to watch her fold under the public pressure and come back to him on his terms. And he'd had Declan's machinery already running so that when she didn't fold, when she walked out with her suitcases instead, he would already have the framework of a counterattack in place. She had outsmarted him, but he had not been unprepared. "Patricia," she said, "does Webb still have access to Celeste's files?" "Presumably, unless he's been terminated." "I need him terminated, today, without alerting him to why." She thought for a moment. "Can you communicate with Celeste directly, attorney to attorney, in a way that preserves privilege and doesn't go through her office's internal systems?" "I can call her personal cell." "Do it. Tell her there's been a security compromise in her staffing. Give her Webb's name and the Pinnacle connection. Tell her to handle it quietly and immediately, and to assume her office systems have been monitored." "And then?" "And then," Elena said, "I need you to figure out whether any of what Webb observed is admissible in a settlement proceeding. Whether Lucian's team can use information that was obtained through a planted operative." Patricia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular energy of an attorney who has just seen the shape of an argument. "If we can demonstrate that Declan employed a planted operative in a professional environment connected to you, outside the scope of a standard marital asset investigation, there's an argument that anything obtained through that channel is tainted. It doesn't necessarily make it inadmissible. Family law isn't criminal procedure, but it changes the ethical landscape of the negotiation significantly." "It means he cheated," Elena said simply. "It means he used methods that cross lines," Patricia said, "which, in a settlement room, with both legal teams present and a judge who will be reviewing the ultimate agreement, matters." "Thursday," Elena said. Thursday, Patricia confirmed. I'll have everything we need. Elena ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she called Celeste's personal cell. Celeste answered on the third ring. Her voice was careful, not the tight, controlled careful of the morning at the coffee shop, but a different texture of careful, like someone who was already partway through a bad thought when the phone rang. Did Patricia call you? Elena asked. 30 seconds ago, Celeste said. I'm looking at Marcus Webb's personnel file right now. Did you know? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. Elena counted them. 3 seconds is a long time when you need the answer to be immediate. No, Celeste said. Elena, no. I hired him through a staffing agency that checked out. I had no reason. I believe you, Elena said. Another pause. Shorter. You do? The timeline doesn't support you knowing. If you'd known, you would have managed what he had access to, and some of the things Declan found, he couldn't have found without complete visibility into the restructuring we did after I left. She said it evenly. You didn't manage what he saw because you didn't know he was watching. Celeste let out a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that had been held for some time. I'm going to terminate him today, Celeste said. Right now, actually, as soon as I hang up. Do it quietly. Don't tell him why. Standard reduction in force language. Understood. And Celeste, I need you to pull everything he had access to in the last 8 months. Everything he could have seen or copied or transmitted. I need a complete list by tomorrow morning. I'll work through the night if I have to. I know you will, Elena said. And then, because it needed to be said, this wasn't your fault. Celeste was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, something underneath the professional control, something tired and real. I should have dug deeper on the agency. You ran a business, not a counterintelligence operation, Elena said. He was looking for weaknesses. He found one. That's on him, not you. She hung up. She sat at her desk in the apartment that was hers and looked at the ceiling and added up what she was dealing with. A settlement meeting in 6 days, a 48-page investigation report, a planted operative whose access she had just severed, a brother whose documented confession was being prepared for Patricia's office, and a husband who had discovered the full scale of what she'd built and was now in some unknown internal state that Declan's report had apparently catalyzed. She thought about what Patricia had said. He wants to sit across from her himself. Not just his attorneys, Lucian, personally. That wasn't standard. That wasn't what powerful men with powerful legal teams did when they were confident in their position. When you're confident, you let the attorneys work and you sign what they bring you. You only show up yourself when you need something the attorneys can't negotiate. She didn't know what Lucian needed. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But she was going to be in that room regardless. She opened a new document on her laptop and began writing. Not the financial documents, not the legal preparation. Something else. She wrote for 2 hours, without stopping, without editing as she went. And when she finished, she read it back once and then saved it and closed the document and didn't look at it again. She needed to know what she wanted to say to him before she was in the room where she'd have to say it. Monday arrived the way Mondays do when you've been dreading them since Friday, faster than reasonable and already at full volume. Elena was in Patricia's office at 8 a.m. The conference table was covered in documents organized into 5 distinct sections, which Patricia walked her through with the systematic clarity of someone who had spent the weekend converting a complex situation into actionable sequence. The voluntary disclosure documentation, the chain of ownership for every asset, the professional history of Marlowe's strategic partners, client records, revenue documentation, the business history that demonstrated this was not marital income being hidden, but professional income being legitimately earned, the Webb investigation, what they had, how it would be deployed, and Elliot's written statement, which Patricia slid across the table in a manila folder. Elena picked it up. She opened it. Elliot's handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven, which was how he'd always written since they were children, like his thoughts moved faster than his hand. He had written 12 pages. He had included dates, locations, descriptions of documents, the name of the intermediary who had approached him, the payment structure, the specific files he had photographed. He had also written 3 paragraphs at the end that were not testimony. They were something else, an accounting of who he was and what he'd allowed himself to become and why, and what he understood now that he hadn't let himself understand then. It was not an excuse. It was not a request for anything. It was just the truth, written by someone who had finally stopped finding reasons to look away from it. Elena read it twice. She closed the folder and set it on the table. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked. "No," Elena said, "but I can be not all right and still function, so let's continue." Patricia continued. They worked through the morning. By noon, Elena had reviewed and signed everything Patricia needed for Thursday. By 1 o'clock, she had eaten half a sandwich from the place on the corner that Patricia's assistant had brought in, which was not enough food but was more than she'd eaten the day before. By 2, she was going through the web documentation with the focus of someone looking for the specific detail that would make the argument land hardest in the settlement room. She found it at 2:23. It was in the list Celeste had compiled of everything Webb had accessed, a complete log of file requests and document retrievals pulled from the office's server history. Most of it was expected: client files, financial reports, correspondence archives. But near the bottom of the list was an item that stopped her. Webb had accessed a folder labeled Personal Correspondence, Arden, C, in the 3rd week of October. The folder contained, among other things, a series of encrypted messages between Celeste and Elena from the period immediately following Elena's departure from Lucian's party. Messages in which they discussed the restructuring strategy, the timing of the voluntary disclosure, the decision to file proactively. He had seen the strategy being made in real time. He had watched them decide to disclose, which meant Lucian had known about the voluntary disclosure before Patricia filed it. She stared at the log entry. Declan had known what was coming. He had told Lucian. And Lucian had let it happen, had not filed a preemptive motion, had not accelerated his own discovery request, had simply waited, had let Elena disclose, had received the full picture of her finances through her own voluntary action rather than through a subpoena. She thought about why. She thought about it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called Patricia. "He let me disclose," she said. "He knew I was going to do it before I did it, and he let me." Patricia was quiet on the other end for a moment. "Say that again." "Webb had access to my communications with Celeste. He saw the decision to file voluntarily before we filed. He would have reported that to Declan. Declan would have told Lucian." She paused. "Lucian didn't try to stop it. He didn't file anything of his own. He just waited." "Why would he—" Patricia stopped. Started again. "He wanted the picture. He wanted to see the full scope without the fight of a discovery battle." "He wanted to know what she'd actually built," Elena said. "It came out differently than she'd intended, less legal, more personal." She caught herself. "He wanted to understand the actual size of it before deciding what to do." "That's still unethically compromised, I know. But Patricia, if he wanted to destroy me with it, he would have used Webb's access to preempt the disclosure, to file his own motions, to position the information as concealment before I could reframe it. He didn't do any of that." She was thinking out loud now, something she rarely did with anyone, and she was aware of doing it and didn't stop because the thinking needed to happen somewhere. He sat and watched, and then withdrew his 50% demand and asked for a personal meeting. "Elena," Patricia's voice was careful, "don't let the meeting make you think." "I'm not thinking anything," Elena said. "I'm just telling you what the evidence shows. The evidence also shows a man who planted an operative in your financial advisor's office for 8 months. "Yes," she said. "It does." She ended the call. She sat alone in her apartment with the evidence of everything spread across the desk and the city outside doing its relentless February thing, and she thought about Lucian Varelli reading 47 pages about a woman he had shared 9 years with and apparently never seen. She didn't let herself feel anything about that. Not yet. Not until Thursday. Wednesday night, she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept cleanly since the night she'd walked out. But Wednesday night was different. It wasn't the anxious, active not sleeping of someone running scenarios. It was the exhausted, spent not sleeping of someone who has burned through their reserves and is running on something else, something underneath the reserves, something that doesn't have a polite name. She got up at 2 a.m. and made tea and sat in the chair by the window. The city was still out there. It was always still out there. January had given way to February, somewhere in the middle of everything, and the lake was doing what it did in February, gray and white and massive and completely uninterested in any of this. She thought about the woman who had sat in this same chair 10 days ago, the night she'd walked out, feeling something she didn't have a clean word for. She still didn't have a clean word for it, but it was bigger now, more complicated, heavier in some parts and lighter in others, in a ratio she couldn't have predicted. She had built something. She had spent 4 years building it while playing a role that required her to be someone else. And the building had required a specific kind of discipline, not just financial, not just strategic, but internal. The discipline of not letting the life she was living convince her that the life she was building wasn't real. The discipline of staying connected to herself while performing a version of herself that Lucian required. It had cost her things she hadn't expected. She had been lonely, for one. Deeply and specifically lonely in the way that's only possible when you are surrounded by people and cannot be honest with any of them. Celeste had known some of it. Patricia had known the legal framework. Elliot had once known her completely, before. Nobody had known all of it. She was still that person, in some ways. Still in the middle of it. The loneliness hadn't resolved just because she'd walked out. If anything, the structure that had organized her life for 4 years, the dual existence, the hidden work, the careful performance, was gone now, and what it left behind was a kind of spaciousness she wasn't yet sure how to inhabit. She drank her tea. She thought about Thursday. She thought about walking into a room where Lucian would be present, and everything would be documented, and her attorneys would be there, and his attorneys would be there, and the full weight of the last 9 years, plus the 4 years she'd spent building an exit from them, would be laid on a conference table 42 floors above Michigan Avenue, and they would negotiate the price of ending it. She was not afraid of the negotiation. She was not afraid of the room. What she was, if she was honest with herself in the 3 a.m. quiet of her own apartment, was afraid of seeing him and finding something there that complicated the simplicity she needed to function. She was afraid that Lucian Varelli, read 47 pages about the woman he'd never bothered to know, might have become someone she wasn't prepared to look at clearly. And she was afraid that it wouldn't matter even if he had. Because the timing of a person changing doesn't retroactively resolve the years before they changed. You don't get credit for the person you became after you did the damage. You only get whatever you build from that point forward on your own, in the space where the damage used to be. She knew this. She had applied it to herself, to her own choices, to the years she had stayed when she could have found a different way sooner. She would have to apply it to him, too. She finished her tea. She went back to bed. She slept 3 hours. It was enough. Thursday morning was sharp and clear, the way February mornings sometimes get in Chicago when the front has moved through and left a sky that's almost violently blue and a cold that bites clean rather than seeps. Elena dressed carefully. Not for him, she was past dressing for him, but for herself. Dark navy, simple lines. The kind of outfit that communicates that you know exactly who you are and have spent no time this morning worrying about whether other people agree. She wore the watch her mother had left her, which she had kept through 9 years of marriage in the same leather case in the back of the closet's upper shelf, because it was the one object she had never let Lucian's world touch. She took a cab. She didn't want to drive. She wanted the 20 minutes in the back seat to sit with her own thoughts without managing anything mechanical. The Sterling Building was on Michigan Avenue between Monroe and Adams, 42 floors of glass and steel that had been there since the 80s and carried the solidity of a time when buildings were built to say something permanent. She went in through the main entrance, through a lobby that smelled of recycled air and marble and the particular cleanliness of spaces that were cleaned very thoroughly and very early every morning. Patricia was waiting in the lobby. She looked at Elena the way doctors look at patients before surgery, assessing, measuring, deciding whether the patient is ready without asking the question directly. "Ready?" she said instead. "Yes," Elena said. They took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The conference room was large and corner-facing, with windows running the full length of 2 walls. Michigan Avenue on one side, the lake on the other. From up here, on a day like this, you could see the ice at the lake's edge and the open water beyond it, and the horizon where everything eventually stopped being specific. Howard Fitch was already seated at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 associates whose names Elena didn't know. He stood when she came in, not warmly, but correctly, and nodded to Patricia. Lucian was not yet in the room. Elena chose her seat deliberately. Not at the end of the table, that was the power position, and claiming it would set a tone she didn't need. She sat on the left side, midway down, with Patricia beside her and a clean view of both door and window. She arranged her documents. She poured water from the carafe on the table. She was looking at the lake through the window when the door opened. Lucian came in alone. No associate alongside him, no second attorney hovering, just Lucian in a dark coat that he was in the process of removing as he walked through the door, folding it over his arm, moving to a chair on Howard's side of the table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided how he was going to be in this room and was not going to deviate. He looked different than he had on Michigan Avenue the previous week. The scaffolding that had been visibly missing then was not back exactly, but replaced by something else, something quieter, something Elena didn't immediately have a name for. He looked at her. She looked at him. Howard began the formal opening, the procedural language of settlement negotiation, the acknowledgement of both parties' presence, the ground rules. Elena heard it with the portion of her attention that needed to hear it and kept the rest of herself steady. Lucian was looking at the documents on the table in front of him. His face was neutral. His hands were flat on the table. Howard laid out Lucian's revised settlement position. Elena heard the number. She heard Patricia go very still beside her. The number was dramatically lower than anything they had anticipated. Not the 50% of Marlowe's strategic partners. Not the aggressive marital asset claim they had prepared to fight. Something else. Something that looked, in its structure, less like a man trying to take everything she had, and more like a man trying to determine a price for getting out cleanly. Patricia leaned in and said something close to Elena's ear. Elena nodded once and looked at Howard. "We'll need a moment," she said. "Can we have the room?" Howard looked at Lucian. Lucian nodded. The attorneys filed out. The room held Elena and Lucian and 42 floors of air between them and Michigan Avenue and the blue February lake. She looked at him directly. "Why?" she said. The word landed in the quiet of the room and stayed there. Lucian looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I read the report," he said. "I know you read the report." "All of it," he paused. "Declan is thorough. He had everything. The clients, the years, the—" He stopped, started differently. "I knew you had something. I suspected. I didn't understand the scope." "And now you do," Elena said. "And now I do." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere far below, a siren moved along Michigan Avenue and faded west. "I also know about Webb." She hadn't expected that. She kept her face still. "I didn't know he was in her office until after the filing," Lucian said. "That was Declan's decision, an operational call. I didn't authorize it directly." He paused. "I'm not saying that to avoid responsibility. I'm saying it because it's accurate." "The distinction matters less than you think," Elena said. "I know that." She looked at him. He looked back. Something moved through the air between them. Not warmth, not reconciliation, nothing that simple or comfortable. Something more honest than either of those things. "The settlement number," she said. "It's a real number," he said, "not a tactic. It's low. I'm aware of what it is." He moved his hands on the table, slightly. A small rearrangement that communicated something he didn't put into words. "I'm not interested in 2 years of litigation, Elena. I'm not interested in—" He stopped. "I spent 9 years not knowing who I was married to. That's on me. I'm not going to spend 2 more years making that cost something it shouldn't." She was quiet. She had prepared for this meeting. She had spent 3 days preparing for arguments, for aggression, for tactics and maneuvers, and the specific warfare of dissolution proceedings. She had not prepared for this. "There's a condition," she said. He waited. "Vincent Caruso." Something shifted in his face. "You bring him back," she said. "Whatever capacity makes sense, but you bring him back. He told you the truth and you punished him for it, and that's not something I'm willing to leave as the outcome." Lucian was quiet for a long time. "That's your condition," he said. "That's my condition." He looked at the window, at the lake, at whatever he was looking at when he looked at things that required thinking before answering. "All right," he said. She held his gaze. She was looking for the thing underneath the word, the calculation, the strategy, the performance of reasonableness designed to get something in return. She looked for it the way she had learned to look for things in 9 years of learning to read this man. She didn't find it. What she found instead was harder to name and harder to dismiss. "I'll tell Patricia we have a framework," she said. She reached for her documents. Her hands were steady. Then Lucian said something she had not expected, in a voice pitched so low it was almost not for her at all. "I treated you like furniture," he said. "I know that now. I don't know what to do with knowing it." Elena's hand stopped on the edge of the document stack. She sat very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at him. "That's not something I can help you with," she said. "That's yours now?" She stood. She walked to the door. She opened it. In the hallway, Patricia was waiting with Howard Fitch and the two associates and the accumulated legal machinery of ending a marriage, and Elena looked at Patricia and said, "We have something to work with." And Patricia looked at her face and nodded, and they went back into the room, and the negotiations began in earnest, and Elena sat at the table 42 floors above Michigan Avenue and did not let herself feel anything that would interfere with finishing what she had started. She would feel it later. Later, in the car, in the elevator, in the apartment. Right now, she had work to do. And Elena Marlowe had always known how to work. The negotiation lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Elena knew the exact duration because she had looked at her watch when they resumed after the attorneys returned to the room, and she looked at it again when Howard Fitch finally said, "I think we have a framework," in the tone of a man who had expected to be in this room longer and was recalibrating his afternoon accordingly. 4 hours and 11 minutes to dismantle 9 years. She didn't know if that was fast or slow. She suspected it didn't matter. The framework was this. Lucian would make no claim on Marlowe's strategic partners, its clients, its revenue, or its corporate structure. He would acknowledge in writing that the business had been built through Elena's independent professional labor. In exchange, Elena would accept a settlement figure representing a portion of the marital estate's liquid assets, a number that was fair without being generous, which was exactly what she had wanted. Neither side would win in the way that felt like winning. Both sides would get something they could live with. Patricia called it a good outcome. Elena called it an outcome. The documents would take 11 days to finalize. They would sign at Patricia's office. There would be no ceremony to it. When the meeting ended, the attorneys gathered papers and exchanged the professional courtesies of people who had been adversaries for an afternoon and would likely be adversaries again in different rooms on different matters. Howard Fitch shook Patricia's hand. The two associates collected folders. The room, which had held so much compressed weight for 4 hours, began to feel like just a room again. A large corner conference space 42 floors up with good views and a water carafe that needed refilling. Elena was putting her documents into her bag when Lucian spoke from across the table. "Elena." She didn't look up immediately. She finished what her hands were doing. Then she looked at him. The attorneys had not quite left. Howard was near the door, coat in hand, in the process of saying something to one of his associates. Patricia was at the credenza, closing her briefcase. Nobody was paying direct attention to the two people across the table from each other, but nobody had left either. Lucian looked at her with the expression of a man who had something more to say and had not yet determined whether saying it was a right he still possessed. She waited. "The web situation," he said quietly. "I'm going to make sure Declan understands that was outside acceptable scope. Professionally." He paused. "It won't undo it." "No," she agreed. "It won't. I know that." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at his face, the face she had studied across 9 years of dinners and events and mornings and silences, and she tried to see it clearly, which was harder than she'd expected, not because she felt too much, but because she had spent so long managing what she allowed herself to feel about it, that the management itself had become a kind of distortion. He looked tired. Not the tired of a single bad week, but the accumulated tired of a man who had run on a particular kind of fuel for a very long time and had finally noticed the gauge. "Thank you," she said, "for the Vincent condition." Something moved across his face. "You shouldn't have had to make it a condition." "No," she said. "I shouldn't have." She closed her bag. She straightened. "Take care of yourself, Lucian," she said. "It was not a warm thing. It was not a cold thing either. It was the thing you say when you have finally arrived at the place where what you feel is neither love nor hatred, but something more exhausting and more permanent than either. The particular weight of having known someone deeply enough to see exactly where they failed, and exactly where you failed alongside them, and choosing to set that weight down not because it has become light, but because carrying it further serves no one." She walked to the door. Patricia fell into step beside her. They took the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, Patricia held the door and they stood on Michigan Avenue in the February cold, and Patricia said, "That went as well as it could have." And Elena said, "Yes," and meant it without enthusiasm, because going as well as something could have gone and going well are not the same thing, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. A cab pulled up without being hailed. Patricia got in first and leaned across to give the driver an address. And Elena stood on the sidewalk for just a moment. One moment. Just her and Michigan Avenue and the February blue above the buildings. And she breathed the cold air in and let it sit in her chest. And then she got in the cab and the door closed and they moved into traffic. She did not look back at the Sterling building. The 11 days that followed were the strangest of Elena's adult life, and she had lived through some genuinely strange ones. They were strange not because of what happened in them, but because of what didn't happen. The machinery of crisis that had organized every waking hour since January. The calls, the restructuring, the legal preparation, the surveillance awareness, the constant low-grade vigilance of someone who knows they are being watched, went quiet. Not all at once, gradually. Like a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot it was there, and then one morning you notice it's gone, and the silence feels wrong before it feels like relief. She worked. Marlowe's strategic partners had clients who needed her attention and projects that had been running on reduced bandwidth for 3 weeks, and an associate named Diane, who had been keeping things functional and professional through all of it, with a competence Elena made a note to address formally and financially as soon as the settlement was signed. She worked 16-hour days, not because she had to, but because the work was real and hers, and it needed doing. And there was a specific satisfaction in that, in the uncomplicated reality of work that belongs to you, that you chose, that produces something that didn't exist before you made it. She slept better. Not well. Better. She talked to Patricia 3 times in those 11 days, twice about document language, and once, briefly, about nothing related to the case. Just a conversation that happened because Patricia called to check on something minor, and they ended up talking for 20 minutes about a restaurant on Randolph that Patricia recommended and Elena had not yet been to. It was the kind of conversation she hadn't had in a long time. Ordinary, sideways, not oriented toward anything except itself. She did not talk to Lucian. She did not talk to Elliot. She was not ready for Elliot yet, and she knew it. And she didn't push herself toward ready because she had learned, in the particular school of the last 9 years, that readiness isn't something you manufacture through willpower. It arrives when it arrives. Forcing it produces something that looks like readiness and isn't. On the 8th day, Vincent Caruso called. She almost didn't answer. She didn't have his number saved, but she had a memory for numbers. Had always had it, a minor and mostly useless gift. And she recognized it from a contact card he had given her at a company function 3 years ago that she had never expected to use. She answered. "Ms. Varelli," he said. Then, catching himself, "Elena." "Vincent. I wanted to call to—" He stopped, started differently. "Lucian called me yesterday. He asked me to come back. Reduced role, different responsibilities. I wanted you to know he followed through." She was standing at the kitchen counter, still in the early part of the morning, coffee in hand. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it. "It shouldn't have been your condition to set," he said. It echoed what Lucian had said in the conference room, and she wondered briefly if they had spoken about it, if Lucian had told him, and she found she didn't mind if he had. "Maybe not," she said, "but it was the right outcome regardless of who made it happen." A pause. "How are you?" It was a simple question, a genuine one. She could hear the genuineness in it, the slightly awkward directness of a man who was not practiced at gentle inquiry, but was making the effort. "Working on it," she said honestly. "That's the right answer," he said. They spoke for 4 minutes. It was not a long conversation, and it didn't need to be. When she hung up, she stood at the counter for a moment and thought about the unlikely geometry of the people who had surrounded her through this. Celeste, Patricia, Vincent, even Elliot in his broken and costly way, and the strange fact that none of them had been there by design. They had arrived through the ordinary accumulation of years and choices and the particular accidents of who you become and who you allow near the real version of yourself. She finished her coffee. She went to her desk. She worked. On the 11th day, she signed the divorce papers in Patricia's office at 2 in the afternoon. Patricia had arranged for a notary. The papers were in order. 43 pages of careful legal language that translated 9 years of a life into a documented conclusion. Elena read every page. She had always read everything, even when Lucian had found that quality exhausting, and she was not going to stop now because she was tired. She signed where indicated. The notary witnessed. Patricia countersigned where her role required. It took 19 minutes. When it was done, Patricia poured 2 small glasses of something from a bottle in her desk drawer. Whiskey, Elena thought, something old enough to be serious. And she set one in front of Elena without ceremony or announcement. Elena picked it up. Patricia picked up the other. They did not toast, they just drank, which felt more accurate to what the moment actually was. "What's next?" Patricia asked. "Work," Elena said, "and eventually figuring out what I do with the rest of it." "The rest of what?" Elena looked at the glass in her hand. "The space," she said. "I spent 4 years building an exit. Now I'm out. I haven't figured out yet what you do with all the space on the other side of an exit." Patricia looked at her with the expression of someone who has seen many people arrive at this particular threshold and understands that there is nothing useful to say about it. "You'll figure it out," she said, not as a comfort, as a statement of observed fact. Elena finished the whiskey. She put on her coat. She shook Patricia's hand, properly, firmly, the handshake of 2 professionals at the conclusion of something real, and then she left. The storage unit was in a facility on the northwest side, a climate-controlled building the color of old concrete, the kind of place that exists in every major city as a repository for the things people aren't ready to decide about. Elena had rented the unit 4 years ago when she had first begun the process of separating the self she was performing from the self she intended to keep. She had put things there that had no place in Lucian's house, not because they were hidden, exactly, but because they belonged to a version of her life that predated his, and she had not wanted them absorbed into the ambient texture of the mansion, displayed or stored or managed according to his sense of what her past should look like. She went there on the Saturday after the signing, in her own car, on a morning that was cold and bright and sharper than it had any right to be. The unit contained 11 boxes. She had labeled them in her own handwriting 4 years ago, with labels that were partly practical: books, documents, Miss Kitchen, and partly the kind of private shorthand you use when you're the only audience. One box was labeled before or, in block letters, without further explanation. She loaded the boxes into the car herself. It took 3 trips and 40 minutes, and she was genuinely out of breath by the end of it, which was irritating and also clarifying in the way that physical effort is sometimes clarifying. It returned her to the straightforward reality of a body doing a thing in a specific space with specific weight, and the straightforwardness of it was its own kind of relief. She drove back to the Streeterville penthouse. She unloaded the boxes herself, making the same 3 trips in reverse, and stacked them in the main room of the apartment. She looked at the stack for a moment. 11 boxes representing the pre-Lucian architecture of her life, sitting in the post-Lucian architecture of her life, waiting to be integrated into whatever came next. She made tea. She started with the practical boxes, the books first, then the kitchen items, then the documents she sorted into the filing system she'd established when she moved in. It took most of the afternoon. She worked without music, which was how she had always preferred to work when she was thinking through something. The sound of the apartment, the climate system, the occasional city noise rising 31 floors, the small percussions of her own movement through the space, was company enough. The before box she left for last. She carried it to the chair by the south-facing window in the early evening, when the light was doing the thing it did in February at this hour, flat and orange and final, slanting across the floor in long shapes that moved as you watched them. She set the box on the floor beside the chair and sat down and looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. The box contained the things she had known it would contain, because she had packed it herself and remembered most of what she'd put in it. Her mother's photograph. She set it immediately on the windowsill, where she'd wanted it for 3 years. A small collection of books she'd loved in her 20s. A scarf she'd had since university. A notebook, half filled with the handwriting of a younger version of herself. And near the bottom, under the scarf and the notebook, a program from a university lecture series. It was thin, printed on cardstock that had softened over the years, and it was folded to the page containing a keynote address that she had attended at 22 in a crowded auditorium on a Thursday afternoon when she should have been doing something else. She unfolded it. In the margin of that page, in handwriting she barely recognized as her own, younger, less controlled, still working out its form, was a sentence she had written during the address, apparently as the speaker said something that hit differently than she'd expected. She read it. "The work is not proof of your worth. The worth was already there." She sat very still. She had written that at 22. She had meant it then, had felt it as true in the specific and urgent way you feel things at 22, before life accumulates enough material to test whether your beliefs are structural or decorative. Then she had spent 17 years living a life that systematically tested that sentence, and she had failed the test more times than she could count. Had measured herself through Lucian's eyes because he was there, and his eyes were constant, and the alternative, maintaining your own measure in the face of someone else's continuous countermeasurement, required a kind of stamina that nobody talks about honestly. The stamina of remaining yourself inside a relationship that keeps offering you a replacement self. Easier, simpler, requiring so much less. She had failed that test. She had also, eventually, passed it. Not cleanly. Not without cost. Not in the way of a story where the protagonist arrives at the right answer on schedule and the arriving makes everything that came before worthwhile in a neat and satisfying way. Real things don't resolve like that. Real things leave marks. The marks don't go away when the thing that made them is over. But she was here, in a chair in a room that was hers, holding a piece of paper on which a younger version of herself had written something true. She placed the program on the windowsill beside her mother's photograph. The September light. It was still February, but she thought of September, thought of the light she wanted for this room when September arrived. The light she was imagining spread across the floor in her mind, and Chicago lay below her, and the lake was out there doing what it did, which was existing on its own enormous terms without consulting anyone. She looked at the city for a while. She thought about Elliot. She thought about calling him, then decided not tonight. The decision didn't come from anger. The anger was still there, would be there for a long time, was not something she expected to dissolve cleanly, but from something more considered. The relationship between what Elliot had done and what their relationship could become was not a simple problem with a simple solution. It would require time and structure and honesty and a willingness on his part to continue doing the work he'd started when he wrote those 12 pages. She believed he was capable of that. She also knew that believing someone is capable of change and trusting that they will make that change are different things, and the difference matters. She had earned the right to apply that distinction carefully. She would call him when she was ready. She would know when she was ready because she would no longer be deciding not to call. The readiness would announce itself, or it wouldn't, and either way she would handle it. She thought about Celeste. They had spoken twice in the 11 days since the settlement meeting. Business conversations, primarily, client matters, operational questions, the ordinary working relationship of two professionals who had built something together. But there had been a texture to those conversations that was different from before, something more careful on Celeste's end, a quality of not quite ease that Elena understood as the residue of the Webb situation. Not guilt exactly, Celeste had done nothing wrong, but something adjacent to guilt. The feeling of having been compromised in a context where you believed yourself protected. Elena had not addressed it directly in those calls. She had let the ordinary work of the conversations carry them through, because sometimes the best way to rebuild something is not to address the rupture, but to simply continue building, to let the resumed construction speak to the continuity. They would be all right. She thought about Patricia, who was direct and unsentimental, and had shaken her hand like the conclusion of something real, because it was the conclusion of something real, and who had poured the right amount of whiskey at the right moment without asking whether Elena wanted it. She thought about Vincent Caruso, who had made a phone call at 2:47 in the morning because watching someone be treated badly had finally exceeded the capacity of his loyalty to absorb, and who had sat in Lucian's office and told the truth and taken the consequence without visible fear, and who was now returning to a modified version of his former life, which was its own kind of complicated. She thought about Lucian. She thought about him the way you think about a country you've spent a long time in and will not return to, with the particular combination of familiarity and distance that only geography can provide. She knew that landscape intimately. She knew its patterns and its dangers and the specific way it looked in the morning and the way it changed when the weather shifted. She knew it well enough to know she was done traveling there. She did not know who he would become after this. That was no longer her territory. She hoped, in the quiet and non-performative way you hope for things that are genuinely not your business anymore, That reading 47 pages about the woman he'd never known would produce something in him that was worth producing, not for her sake, for his own. Because whatever Lucian Varelli had done and been, he was still a person inside it, somewhere under the performance and the power and the specific damage that powerful men absorb and redistribute. And persons can sometimes use a hard fact the way a whetstone is used, to become sharper, more honest, more accurate about what they actually are. She did not know if he would. She knew it was not hers to determine. She picked up the old university program from the windowsill. She read the sentence again. The work is not proof of your worth. The worth was already there. She had spent 4 years building proof. She had built it meticulously, invisibly, with a patience that had cost her sleep and connection and the kind of ordinary human ease that comes from living a life without a hidden parallel life running alongside it. She had built the proof because she had needed it, needed the concrete, documented, legally structured evidence that she was capable of existing on her own terms before she could trust herself to leave. She understood that now. She hadn't fully understood it while she was doing it. While she was doing it, she had called it strategy, called it preparation, called it prudence. Those things were all true. But underneath them was something else. The need to prove to herself, in terms she couldn't dismiss or qualify, that the worth was in fact already there, that she hadn't been wrong about herself, that the version of Elena Marlowe who had walked into Lucian Varelli's life at 31 had been a real person with real capability, not just a potential that required his context to become actual. She had proved it. The company existed. The accounts existed. The clients existed. The properties existed. All of it documented and legally solid and entirely hers. She didn't need the proof anymore in the way she had needed it. She placed the program back on the windowsill. She stayed in the chair as the evening came in around her, the light shifting through its final changes, the city below continuing its enormous, indifferent life. She did not feel the fireworks she might have imagined for this moment, standing on the other side of 9 years and a crisis and 11 days of legal machinery. She felt something quieter and less cinematic and more durable. She felt like herself. Not the self she'd performed in Lucian's house, nor the self she'd been performing in her parallel life, the careful strategist, the invisible operator, the woman who never let her guard down because letting it down meant risking everything. Neither of those. Something underneath both of them. The self that had been there before the performance began and had survived both performances running simultaneously for years. That self was tired. That self was also, she discovered, still entirely intact. She got up from the chair. She went to the last box, the before box, now empty except for some tissue paper she'd used for packing, and she folded it flat and put it with the other broken-down boxes by the front door. She looked at the apartment. The books were on the shelves. Her mother's photograph was on the windowsill. The old program was beside it. The kitchen items were put away. The filing system contained the documents it needed to contain. The furniture she had chosen for herself sat in the position she had placed it, filling the space in a way that was not perfect. The small couch was slightly too far from the window, and she'd known it since the day it arrived and hadn't moved it yet. But was hers. Imperfect and hers. No secret phone in a drawer. No hidden office accessed through a door kept closed. No husband whose evening mood determined the temperature of every room he entered. No audience gathered to watch what she would do. She turned off the kitchen light. She walked through the apartment and turned off the other lights. She stopped at the south-facing window and looked out one more time at the city, at the towers and the streets, and the lake beyond everything, dark now but present, enormous and cold and permanent in the way that bodies of water are permanent, indifferent to the small human dramas of the shore. She had walked out of a door 10 weeks ago. She had been watched, investigated, betrayed, disclosed, negotiated, and signed. She had done most of it while shaking in elevator cars and shower stalls and 3 a.m. chairs, and nobody in any of the rooms where it mattered had ever known about the shaking, because she had given herself exactly as much time as the shaking needed, and then she had gone back to work. That was not a perfect quality. It was not entirely healthy. It was the quality of someone who had learned to function inside difficulty, because the alternative was not functioning, and not functioning had never been a viable option. She was going to have to learn some different things. How to let the difficulty be visible sometimes, to people who had earned the right to see it. How to inhabit a life that was hers without organizing it entirely around contingency and escape. How to trust the ground under her feet instead of always measuring its stability. She would learn those things. She was not going to pretend it would be easy or quick or that she would do it gracefully. She would probably do it the way she did most things, with more control than was strictly necessary and more feeling than she let show, getting it partially wrong before getting it more right, taking longer than she'd planned, and arriving somewhere she hadn't quite anticipated. That was fine. She was good at arriving somewhere she hadn't quite anticipated. She turned from the window. She went to bed. She lay in the dark of her apartment and listened to the specific quiet of 31 floors above a city that was always doing something even when it wasn't doing anything visible. And she felt the mattress under her and the cold air on her face above the blanket and the particular sensation of being in her own body, in her own room, in her own life, with no performance required of her by anyone. She did not feel free in the way the word is used in songs and speeches. Freedom was turning out to be quieter than that, more granular, more ongoing. Not a destination, but a daily accumulation of small, true choices. She had made one of those choices tonight, by going to the storage unit, by bringing the boxes home, by putting the program on the windowsill and letting it mean what it meant. Tomorrow, she would make more. She closed her eyes. The city went on outside the window. The lake went on beyond the city. Elena Marlowe went on breathing in the dark, which was not a spectacular thing, but was the most essential one, and she was, finally, imperfectly, at considerable cost, doing it entirely on